All right, so I made a error in my previous. Tilt this so that the sunlight is dramatic, affecting the camera. You know what? If I shift over, it won't. Let's make a relocation. Sorry for the delay. I guess that's a little bit better. Slightly less light on that side. So I made an error, and this is actually going to be chapters 12 and 13 because I forgot that we had done 11 already. So that's going to be today. It's probably going to be a little while. I might do a quick break and cut to the artwork for a minute or two between chapters just so I can have the opportunity to recoup. But only one quick announcement. That is, if you are in the newsletter, you're going to be getting an update either today or tomorrow with a excerpt from book 3. That excerpt will be rough, but it will be an excerpt that you can look at and get a bit of a preview if you've already read the first two of what's coming in the third one. No guarantees that anything you read in those previews make it to the actual book when it's published, but you get at least a look at some of the things that I've been working on. No idea how long it's going to be, but if you want to be in the get the newsletter and you don't get it now, shoot me a message either in chat or send it to @LegacyChronicle on Twitter. You can DM me and I'll send you the email, or you can give me your email and I'll make sure you get added to the list. So, in the previous chapter, we're introduced to Raymer's grandfather, Algathor Squall, who is the last of the male squalls still active in Glaciar, which is their their home base in Nepal. We also had a interaction of Trem and the others meeting Gend, Sorastor Gend, and Wrath, two travelers who are telling them that they can help them figure out their way to get to Southron, which is where Ghost wants to be for reasons to pick up this package that he has yet to explain. He then is forced to tell the group that what he's actually, maybe not forced, but convinced to tell the group that the packages he is looking for are some form of information on weapons that might lead him to be able to confront Wolfbane and the Nerathian army that have taken Nepal from him and his people. So, chapter 12. I'll back this up just a touch. Exhaustion from travel and his inner conflict sunk Trem into a dreamless sleep. He floated suspended in space and time. He exulted in the peace, hovering far from the dangers of mortal life, safe and carefree. It was impossible to say how long he dwelt in this place of recovery and calm, but slowly a voice began to pierce the darkness. Trem gradually came to a state of semi-consciousness as it grew stronger about him. Trem Waterhound. The tone and inflection was unfamiliar but not threatening. Hear me. Lend me your ear. Curvin? Trem asked the darkness, still unsure of who was out there, or how they'd found him when he had remained apart from the dreamscape. You're in grave danger, Trem. The voice grew stronger. It was a male voice of a mature owner, but Trem could not see where the words came from. It was naught but black and quiet all around. I know you sought me before, but were unable to find me in this world, but I did hear your call. There is a threat in Delmore that will divide your newfound company. You must make the proper choice when the time comes. Grandfather Forrest, Trem questioned, but knew the answer instinctively. Is this about Wrath's warning to me earlier? Perhaps. Any of your companions might be a danger to you. You must remain cautious, Trem, and stand by yourself above all else. The dreaming world had begun to find stability and substance as Trem drifted back to the voice. He was unable to solidify his vision of Garand Oakheart. He suspected because he had only known him as a soul encased in a natural vessel, and Garand likely projected his own vision of himself as he had been in life. Still, the vague and jittering form he was able to bring before him was clearly humanoid in shape. Your advice has changed since we last spoke. Was it not you who told me to leave Silverleaf and help Javanaleth, or else risk not living? I've had time to reconsider my position in some ways. I would not wish anything ill to befall you. And is there some looming threat you foresee, more than the strange beings that haunt our steps or the violent rumors from the north? There was some hesitation in the reply. I have learned only of something which will come soon, and the danger it poses to you. You know, Trem said, doubt creeping thickly into his response. I would have trusted another who has been kind enough to aid me with predictions of my future, but he refused to give me too much information. Curvin had begun to seem more reliable of late, though he can be irritatingly unclear at times. But in truth, it seems he wants me to make my own decisions. Mortals look out for their own, half-elf. The tone was harsh, almost threatening. I remember my mortality. I wish to prolong yours. I see. Trem tried once again to focus on the figure floating unclear and insubstantial before him. Give me your advice, then, Grandfather Forrest. I shall do my best to abide by it. The frustration seemed to fade from his visitor, and the response came through more sympathetic and fatherly. In Delmore, the choice will come to remain and cling to a failing fight for survival, or to move onward towards the possibility of hope. You must do the second. No good will come of the first. Trem found he could not see the form of his host clearly, but it seemed to him some fraction of his face came through a bit clearer in sudden, jerking moments of clarity. So we cannot pause in Delmore. I think this was already our intention, Garand. You need not fear. But you must. The voice and what little of the figure Trem could see began to fade as he squinted and desperately tried to make out what was before him. For a brief second, the face seemed to snap into clear form, and he saw graying brown hair and striking blue eyes, sharp and oddly frightening. Do not tarry there, Trem. Move on for your own sake and that of those with you. There was a sharp, cracking sensation, and the voice and figure were gone. Trem felt very unsure of this entire interaction, perplexed by the warning and the sharp, insistent tone of Garand Oakhart's lingering essence. Something struck him as a miss, but his tired mind pulled him back to quiet sleep and recuperation. As he drifted down to the depths of his rest, the memory of the encounter became jumbled and faded. Soon he was back in void, floating quietly through the night. As Trem slept on, the other travelers made small talk and soon went to their own rest. Shortly after Trem had walked off, Gend had begged to rest as well and been relieved from his brief watch. The halfling found Wrath already asleep in his many black strands of cloth, free of a bedroll or other comforts. In Gend's place, Ghost opted to take first watch, with Logan to be wakened, then Javanaleth. The others filtered into the inky night to sleep, and Ghost set himself against a small boulder near the roadside. The Napoleon had felt a strange comfort come over him the past few days. With his purpose more or less exposed to the others, he had grown more at peace, both with himself and with the experience of traveling with these people. Originally, he had sworn to involve no one else in his mission, but that had proven impossible even before the incident in Guayaquil. He would never have made it out of that inn alone, but he doubted the journey southward would be any easier. They were a motley band, to be certain, but there were real skills among them, and the older man knew his chances of success were far higher as long as they remained with him. Ghost could also inherently sense that Trem, despite his youth, was a kindred spirit. The half-elf might not realize it yet, but Ghost could sense the internal motivation to be someone or something of significance emanating off of him. Somewhat troubling, the others seemed drawn to the half-elf. He was intelligent, certainly, but something else, something unexplainable, lent him a kind of authority that unnerved the Napoleon. There was an aura to him that simply drew others in. Ever a man obsessed with authority and control, Ghost would have expected such a rivalry to infuriate him, but he found Trem's presence to be an odd comfort. Since his departure from his homeland, he had struggled to find purchase in this weak world of the South, where his blunt, assertive behavior was seen as threatening and even insulting to those who would be his followers. A sudden snap to his left made Ghost whirl around, sword drawn, but he saw it was only the young mage. Coughing loudly to cover his brief moment of distraction, he sheathed his blade. Dangerous to be sneaking up on a fellow like that. Why aren't you sleeping, boy? Diaga leaned on his staff and eyed him. For once, I cannot. As to my safety, surely you would not harm a fellow Napoleon. He paused. Then again, I believe you already have. Ghost was immediately on guard. I don't know what you're talking about, boy, but... No, of course not, the young man cut him off. You would have blotted out that terrible memory, Thane Squall. You do not know of what you speak. Diaga took a step forward, and remarkably Ghost recoiled at his approach. Oh, I know exactly of what I speak. Your real name is Thane, or rather former Thane Greymane Squall. You opened the gates to Nepal City. You sacrificed your own people. You even let your own family die. That was not the way it was to be. They were supposed to spare us. My family was to leave with me. Diaga scowled and thrust a lecturing finger at Ghost as he said, You sold out your home. For what? A promotion. Gold. Ghost pointed his own finger back at Diaga defensively. Frothgar blackmailed me, painted me into a corner by paying me to turn to a blind eye to his illegal trades. My reputation would have been ruined. His voice grew fiery with conviction. I was the one who could elevate our house, become the pinnacle of Squall family greatness, and I was handed a war I could not win amid traitors I could not expose. Diaga shook his head. You could have died a hero to the people. If you truly wanted to protect your reputation, you would not have opened the gates. You would have fought to the last. You talk bravely for a whelp who's never seen combat. Diaga ignored the insult. How did you escape the dungeons? Ghost shuddered at the memory. I broke free. One of the guards got too close to the bard, so I snapped his neck. I went looking for my wife and children, but they were already dead. The Nerathians have to pay. Wolfbane has to pay. That's why I need to go south. Diago watched the man seethe emotionlessly. Vengeance will not ease your guilt. Ghost tried to regain his composure, asking, How did you know? I've suspected since Guyla Kill. When you mentioned there was an item you sought to strike back the invaders, the fervor and hate in your voice when you talked of revenge, then I knew. I grew up admiring you and your house when I was an orphan. I even spent my afternoons trying to catch a glimpse of you in the streets until I found my magic and was shipped off to Osmandius. Ghost sat heavily, his head in his hands. The squall line's dead. All I can hope for is the eradication of the men responsible. Frothgar, Caermon Erephos, Darevaron, Wolfbane. With each name, Ghost's fist clenched tighter as his pronunciation became more guttural. Diagon knelt beside him, whispering in his ear, You can make this right. Find what you seek, fight the invaders, but do it justly. Do it to free the Napoleon people. Do it for something more than just revenge. Ghost looked up at the young man. Until now he considered him little more than a burden on their travels. He was no longer so sure of his worthlessness, but his imploring words did not change Ghost's conviction. He was young and weak, and there was no turning back. I am incapable of anything but revenge, boy. It's a fact of my life I have embraced. You'd be wise to join me in my quest for it. You should not expect all of us to follow you into oblivion. Our paths are the same now, but if you pursue this selfish road, they will diverge. Diago paused before adding, You may keep your identity to yourself, Greymane. After all, you're no longer the man you once were. With that, Diago melted into the night, leaving Greymane's squall, traitor to his family, to finally die. Since he had fled like a mad beast from Nepal City, Ghost had been at war with himself, or rather with the man he had once been. Now with Diago's harsh reminder of his past, he no longer felt the need to hold on to what shreds of his former self remained. When the morning light came, Ghost had still not awakened the others for their watch. He had buried his past. In that one night, all traces of Greymane's squall were burned from Teth Tanir. Only the ashes of an old man's memory remained, and the true life of the vengeful spirit named Ghost had finally begun. Two other squalls were in grave danger of dying in a more concrete sense that morning. While Algathor had managed to rebuke the first attempt of the Nerathians to enter his home, it would surely not be the last, and the two men who would beat upon his door were far easier to intimidate than a squadron would be. He and his guests now remained on alert, for it was obvious that the presence of Romond, Edge, and Raymir was well known. For his part, Saltillion was furious. His plan had been to gather a large force and storm the house without prelude, but the overeager guards had ruined that trying to curry favor with the wizard. Saltillion had them beaten and dispatched far to the north, where the winter chill would teach them a lesson, if they survived it at all. Saltillion opted not to change his strategy, however. A frontal assault would certainly overwhelm an old man and three tired fugitives with nowhere to go. He gathered the entire garrison of Glacier outside the home and delivered his instructions to the guard captain. You will kill all of them. Save the girl. I want the traitor's head for Wolfbane to see. The captain saluted and went to relay Saltillion's orders. The wizard hung back just outside the gate so he could watch his plan unfold in safety. Having driven the guards from his front door with a series of threats and meaningful gestures of his spear, Algathor Squall had set himself in the small study next to the main entrance and was watching through the curtain for a renewed attempt to gain entrance to his home. Roman had been sent to rummaging through the cellar for supplies, as the head of the Squall home was determined his guests should move on, and swiftly, hopefully to avoid bloodshed they all seemed assured was coming, but determined not to mention, as though its leaving it unspoken would somehow prevent it from occurring. Raymir walked into the room and sat near her grandfather without speaking, her clothes changed into more practical garb for traveling. She wore a heavy olive green dress with leather boots, belt, and bracers. The dress had slits up the sides, almost to her hips, and she wore tan deerskin pants beneath. She eyed her grandfather, dressed for battle in what would have been a comical fashion given his advanced age, but for the glint of danger in his eyes. Without looking at her, the older man said, I am glad I kept some of your things here, my dear. Otherwise you'd have little to choose from. Raymir brushed her knees self-consciously. I could have made do, grandfather. Yes, he said, I'm sure you could have. You're a squall, through and through, a fierce lover and a deadly foe all at once, and able to switch between both at a moment's notice. Grandfather! Raymir laughed and blushed slightly. What could possibly give you reason to think that? His eyes turned towards her, and Algathor smiled sadly. I know what you've been through, and what you must go through still. You're a hard woman, Raymir, not a girl anymore. I'm proud, and also very sorry that it came to this. His words struck her deeply, and Raymir did not answer for a time. They sat there in quiet, watching the windows together before she said, Edge would leave me here. He means to help Romond, I can sense it, but he thinks I have to be sheltered from the world. Algathor scoffed. He's a fool, and in love. You can't blame him for wanting to protect you. In time, he'll learn that we squalls provide our own protection. Algathor turned to her and said, in a gentler voice, But do let him shield you from harm, my dear. I wish to see you survive these dark days. I know you cannot stay here. You must not stay here. But please don't throw your life away either. You're all I have left. Raymir felt tears welling in her eyes and saw the same on her face of her beloved grandfather. She went to him and the two embraced for a moment, and she turned away and he back to the window. She wiped her eyes and said, I should see if Roman needs help in the cellar. Algathor did not respond, but waved her away. She left the room, and he sat there a while longer as morning passed into afternoon. Some hours later, the Nerathian guards began to gather outside. Within the house, Algathor, now joined by Edge, sat at the front windows while Raymir and Roman slept briefly on cots in the back room. The old man was now fully armored, heavy steel plate covering his far thinner leather cuirass, and wearing a helm of layered crags of metal extending from over the forehead to a rounded peak. He hefted his spear and eyed the young stranger. My granddaughter seems to have been greatly taken with you. Edge was cautious in his reply. I am also with her, my lord. Algathor grunted. Oh, do stop calling me that, you fool. The name is Algathor, all right? Yes, sir. I mean, Algathor. Good. That wasn't so bad, was it? No, sir. Algathor chuckled slightly as Edge tried to recover. You are young, aren't you? I don't remember what the other was like too clearly, but he was about your age, maybe. I'm sorry, Algathor. I don't understand what you mean. Your name, lad. Algathor leaned on the shaft of the spear and studied Edge closely. Elvak, a name that, in these lands at least, still carries great respect. I told you our family once fought with a lost elf from Osmandius named Xantes Elvak. Well, once when I was far younger, another of your kind by the name of Vaktin Elvak came asking after Xantes' story. He had the same odd cloak clasps you've got on now. Edge touched his shoulder where the hands held his cloak chain and said, I've heard Vaktin's name spoken of as more of a curse. Yes, Algathor replied. He supposedly killed Bullwife Margrave, commander of the Eagle Knights, in the fortress of Aves before being run through himself. Why do you say supposedly? Because even in my memory full of cobwebs and half-images, I recall the make of the man. He was not a traitor, though perhaps my inability to detect such qualities in those close to me makes my opinion of no importance in this regard. The mood darkened significantly, and they sat in silence a while longer until Edge finally spoke quietly. What will we do if they come in force? The old campaigner looked at him. You fear for your life, boy. Edge shook his head resolutely. Only hers. A good answer, Algathor smiled and his face grew grave. When they come, because they will soon enough, we will do nothing. I will hold them off while you escape. Edge was puzzled. Escape, Algathor? There's only one way out of the city. Algathor shook his head. Glaciar was a mining town first and foremost. We dug those tunnels deep, and one of them is how the damned Arathos bastards escaped, only to come back again and again to pester us like an infestation. But it has been the duty of the Squall family to watch over the old mines, and the way through the mountains to bar their return, or in this case, the pursuit of your enemies. There's a narrow path between the manor that opens up against the side of the nearest mountain. Raymir knows of it from her childhood, though she never knew its purpose. You'll see just beyond my back door. Try to block the exit of this place when you leave, to slow them down. I have a little surprise for any who do follow you into the pass. He paused a moment before adding, You'll have to carry Raymir. She won't leave me. Edge's eyes widened in understanding as he said, You can't really mean to stay, Algathor. We all could escape. The old man rounded on him. I'm not young enough to survive the frozen reach, but I can fight, boy, and like a true squall, I'm going to give myself to buy time for those I love. He grabbed the young man by the front of his tunic, and Edge was surprised at the strength of his grip. You will take my granddaughter from here, Edgewolf Elbach, and you will love her all your life and give her everything she desires. You'll build her a home far from the madness of this world and grow old with her. That is an order. He released Edge, and the lost elf was surprised to see tears fill the old man's eyes, which seemed to him suddenly far, far away. You'll protect the last of my kin with all your might, and be kind to my great-grandchildren. Tell them of their dear ancestor Algathor. Tell them, he paused wistfully, tell them I died a warrior of my people. There came a roar outside the manor gate as the guards charged the house. Algathor and Edge stared sharply at the rushing mob. Then Edge was hurled down the hall by a powerful shove of the old man's arm, stumbling toward where Roman and Raymir lay resting. Save my grandchild, warrior. I'll hold them as long as I can. Edge paused a moment, watching the older man ready himself. Then he spun and charged down the hall as the last great warrior of the Squall line burst from his home to meet the enemy. Edge sobbed as he heard the clash of metal and the roar tearing from Algathor's ancient chest. Come to me, you lucky devils. Let me carve the way to the dead realms for us all. Raymir and Roman were awake already, he standing in the doorway ready to join Algathor's mad assault. Roman clutched his sword and caught Edge's look as the lost elf ran towards them. Raymir suddenly launched herself from the room, hearing her grandfather's cries. Grandfather, I'm coming. But Edge held her fast, keeping her from tearing down the hall to her grandfather. She beat at him wildly as Roman stared in shock. Edge, what are you doing? We have to help him. Edge shook his head, his eyes running freely. There's a way out. Roman still looked unsure. Damn it, Roman, I promised him. That seemed to settle it for the man from Hethagar. He grabbed Raymir by the waist, tearing her away from Edge, and started down the hall. I've got her. See if you can help Algathor. Where is it? Edge was already moving towards the front door. There's a back entrance, end of the hall. Roman redoubled his efforts as the screaming Raymir kicked and contorted, trying to break free. He hauled her down to the edge of the hallway. Raymer, listen to me. Your grandfather's giving his life for you. Now we have to go now. Help me open the door, quickly. Raymer pushed him away as she gathered herself, and at first he thought she might attack him, but instead she stood staring at a large bookcase at the end of the corridor. Suddenly she snatched something from the shelf, then grabbed the sides, and hurled the obstruction aside with strength born of inexpressible grief. Wrenching the now revealed door open, she stumbled forward a few steps and fell sobbing into the gently falling snow, unable to move. Roman made sure she was staying put and had nowhere to go, then drew his sword and ran back down the hall to rescue Edge. The old warrior of House Squall had pushed far from his front door and into the courtyard. Algathor was bleeding from dozens of cuts all over his body, yet he was surrounded by dead and dying guards, and those unscathed refused to get any closer to the whirlwind of death his spear and sword still created. The guard captain made a desperate lunge at him with his own blade and felled his face split down the middle from an expertly swung spear as Algathor danced his way to his doom. Saltillion could see the warrior was tiring, though he could not believe such an aged man could have killed almost a score of young guards. He screamed over the roars of the ancient Napoleon, "Stand clear, you fools! He'll bleed out soon enough." The guards complied, happy to step back from the raging maelstrom of steel before them. Algathor called out to the mage, his lips flecked with blood. "Come on, you coward! Fight me yourself!" Saltillion did not move. Algathor grinned like a mad thing. "Then I shall come to you." He began to rush forward, and the ranks parted as the guards continued to distance themselves from this man who would not die. Saltillion shrieked for them to close with him, to stop his charge, but none listened. Mere feet from the mage, Algathor stumbled, as did a terrified Saltillion, falling onto his back and cowering like a child. The old man raised his spear, a blank stare coming over his face. He tried to focus, but it seemed there were several mages prostrate before him, all little more than vague shapes in the slowly falling snow. Algathor could not see. He shook his head to clear his vision, but he heard the voice of his son's murdered family calling to him. He fell to his knees, a smile coming over his cragged face. "Children, my grandchildren, at last I have found you." Algathor fell into the blood-reddened snow, his soul fleeing his body to join his descendants, and so passed the last legendary Thane of the Squall family warriors. Edge arrived at the doorway in time to see the great man fall. He groaned in despair, too late to drag Algathor back from his doom, as the figure slumped in the snow. Almost immediately the guards were upon him. They had seen the inexplicably unstoppable Algathor fall and felt a renewed surge of bloodlust and anger at the deaths of their fellow men. Edge whirled his halberd, killing the first two to approach the door, but the press of bodies forced him back into the entryway. He felled another intruder before taking a sword in his thigh, and he stumbled back still farther, trying to narrow the avenue for his enemies to attack him. Suddenly, Roman was at his side, thrusting his blade and driving back the enemy with the ferocity of his own attack. He grabbed Edge and yelled, "Hold on to me! Hold on!" They each swung one last time, then whirled and lurched down the hall to the rear exit. Roman heaved Edge with all his might through the gap, and then spun and threw himself at the door in time to close it. The guards pressed against the other side, sliding Roman back a few steps. Then suddenly Raymer was beside him, forcing the door shut. She slammed the slide bar bolt in place, and they returned together, grabbing either side of Edge's shoulders and racing for the narrow pass in the distance. They tore across the deepening snow. Edge hobbled along, leaning heavily on Roman as they did. Raymer was in front, forcing her way forward determinedly. They reached the narrow opening in the mountains, and Raymer spun, her heavy outdoor cloak swirling behind her. The back door bulged and cracked as the guards battered against it. Edge lurched his way to her side, and Raymer grabbed his free arm, and together, she and Roman pulled him into the opening of the narrow pass. As they rounded the corner, Edge could see thick ropes extending out either side of the trail under the snow, and running up the mountainside, rising above them to the north and south. Roman heard the explosion of timber and the shouts of the guards. Raymer slowed and shoved him to the right, crying, "Grab the rope and pull. Be ready to run." Roman did not stop to argue, grasping the coarse, heavy cord and pulling sharply. He was surprised when the rope came loose easily, though he heard a low, thunderous sound from above him, rapidly building. Roman looked skyward and saw, perhaps halfway up the mountainside, a gathering cloud of rolling snow coming down on either side of their position in the pass. Raymer screamed over the gathering roar, "Roman, help me!" That broke the trance. Roman grasped Edge's arm, and together the three raced as fast as they could drag themselves away from the avalanche. Edge could not hear anything except for the incredible noise of the careening whiteness behind him. It felt as though it was rushing to swallow them up like some ravenous beast. A great gust of wind hit them in the back, and the three fugitives flew forward, landing safely in the soft, newly fallen snow. Roman turned on his side to look back at the pass, now completely erased by the destruction of the deluge. Raymer rose slowly, exhausted, and threw herself sobbing into Edge's arms as the weight of what had just transpired finally hit her. Roman slumped against the pillow of snow opposite the two and closed his eyes. Eventually, Raymer cried herself to sleep, and the two sat alone in the eerie silence, the sun falling rapidly behind the mountains. Roman opened his eyes and stared at Edge. "There are only a few moments in my life that have been as dark as this one." "Were you lost in the frozen north those times as well?" Edge asked gloomily. Roman sat up a bit. "Lost?" "Algathor never explained where the pass goes. Even if we end up near a campsite, we could miss it from a bare 10 yards if the weather is the way it was when I first came here. Not to mention it seems winter has come on earlier than I expected. Roman seemed to understand. It's nearer to winter than it should be, an ill omen if I've ever seen one. It's possible the weather will be worse than when you arrive by the time we get through the mountains. But we'll be all right, no matter the situation. You seem upbeat for a man with limited supplies in a frozen wasteland without any sense of direction. Roman grinned. I think your brave young lady may have the answer to our prayers. He pointed to a sheet of parchment on which Raymer had loosened her fierce grip in her sleep. That looks from here to be a map. It seems old Algathor did not send us out blind after all. Edge smiled fondly. I should have known. He never let his granddaughter leave without guidance. Roman heaved himself up from the snow and walked over. Let me see that leg. Edge moved his limbs slightly, felt a lancing pain, and gasped. He tried to put on a brave face, saying, I don't think it's too deep. All the same, Roman pulled forth some clean cloth and undid a leather strap from his waist. Better to get some pressure on it now, and we can see about healing it more thoroughly later. Roman tightened the belt around Edge's leg, ignoring his wincing as he did. The blood soaked into the cloth, but did not seem to be worsening. Satisfied he'd done all he could, Roman returned to his side of the path, undid his bedroll, and laid it down. Edge looked at the man he was now indebted to for so much. You saved my life back there, Roman. I'll repay you. Roman's head came up from his blanket. Repay me? I believe I owe you for a welt on your head and safe passage from Nepal City. No, my brave young friend. You owe me nothing. It was the least I could do. Edge smiled, which quickly turned to a yawn. Pulling Raymer protectively closer, he adjusted to a more comfortable position and soon joined her in slumber. The moon, now rising quite high in the starry sky, shone brightly over them as they fell into an exhausted sleep, the gentle snow still falling silently around their weary bodies. Saltilion's sleep came much harder. He was both furious and relieved. Furious at losing his prize and relieved that his failure had not cost him his life. He'd stayed clear while the remaining guards buried the Napoleon, afraid the sight of him might once again cause him to vomit as he had when he foolishly scrambled away from the specter of the dying man. Saltillion had locked himself within his private quarters at the inn he claimed, until the guards came to tell him Algathor was truly dead. Even then, Saltillion stayed in his quarters, trying to stop the shaking, nauseous sickness that came over him. Eventually, he settled on studying his spellbooks, reciting incantations he should have known by heart, only to find he'd forgotten them. Even that was not enough, so he finally removed the oddly sized and bound text from his robes and sat with it. For several hours, it remained unopened as he simply stroked the surface of it, calming his frayed nerves. His fear slowly turned to curiosity and a strange, unexplainable need to open the book. Saltillion, who had been laying on his bed, twitching and convulsing until he began fondling the odd tome, rose and set it on the small end table. He flipped to several pages mechanically, but at last one caught his attention and he held it open before him. The words, still incomprehensible, swam before his eyes for several seconds, and he felt transported to another place. He could not say how long he sat there, frozen, but he snapped suddenly out of his entrancement and knew immediately what he must do. Still, it took him several moments to even begin to consider closing the book, and when he did, he found his mind still swirled with images and ideas of which he could only fathom the barest portion. When Saltillion had finally cleared his head enough to call in a guard, he had a plan. He listened indifferently as the guard informed him that 22 men had died, taking the manor, 11 more when the pass the fugitives fled through was blocked by sudden avalanche. The guard started to inform him of the recent appointments and promotions following the disastrous affair, but Saltillion cut him off. I understand that you managed to wound the former officer, Edgewolf. The guard nodded. Saltillion stood from his bed, where he had been sitting aloof throughout the report. He walked to the small armoire that was the only furniture in his sparse quarters, aside from his bed and end table, and poured himself a glass of wine. He turned slowly to face the guard, taking in the drink's alluring aroma. You will find some of his blood. It need not be fresh. Bring it to me. The guard stood as if waiting for more, then hurried out of the room when he realized there was to be no further direction. Saltillion turned back to his book to wait, staring at it as though it spoke to him from its quiet seat on the table edge. He set his wine down on the cabinet once again and looked up at the wardrobe, whose doors had several fine, mirrored glass panes at the top. Saltillion examined his face with its pale, almost dead skin, his sunken eyes and hooked nose, his dead, limp black hair slick with grease. He snarled, revealing crooked yellow teeth, and hurled his wineglass at the armoire, shattering it and the mirrored glass at the doors. Saltillion stared at the shattered pieces on the floor and breathed short, ragged breaths. Memories from Ozymandias flooded back to him. The cruel lesson Cuthal had tried to teach him before he departed. Each wizard, upon graduating to independent study and arcane practice, was given a gift from his teachers. When he learned his was to come from the High Wizard himself, Saltillion had been elated and arrogant to be chosen for such an honor. But the gift from Cuthal had been nothing more than an elegant golden hand mirror. It was to remind him that the power he sought could do nothing about the condition of his appearance, which had always driven his hate. The mirror was supposed to teach him to accept, to forgive, the disgust others felt for him, and turned to them with kindness. Cuthal swore that his image would change, and he would see his true self, his inner self. Sultan had long ago realized that his inner self was the image he already saw. That same foul visage that had always drawn stones and insults from others as a child was his true self. His soul was as twisted as his face, and he found now that he could comfortably embrace that. He had smashed that mirror on the stones of his quarters in Osmandius, leaving its broken shards to be found and removed by the servants. In the end, he had dismissed both the gift and the lesson. A shuffling of feet behind Sultan interrupted his reminiscing. He turned to see the guard he had sent out standing there, a bloody sword in his hand. Wordlessly, he took the weapon from the guard and, using his long fingernails, scraped the semi-dry blood into a fresh wine cup. Muttering in an ancient language, one reminiscent of the arcane words of the gods, yet somehow older and more twisted, he wove a complicated spell that set the wine glowing to a faint blue. His audience, the young guard, was curious enough to come closer, eyeing the concoction. Sultan looked at him, his voice suddenly clear and distant as he asked, "You want to know what this will do, this little potion of mine?" The guard nodded silently. Sultan bent and picked up a large shard of reflective glass from the floor. "It will show me where our friends are, once it's complete." The guard looked puzzled. "You need glass to finish the job." Sultan smiled slightly. "No." He rammed the shard into the guard's throat, holding the wine glass beneath it to catch his spurting blood. "I need fresh life to find them." Sultan grimaced as he heard his stutter return. Ignoring the spasms of the still bleeding guard, he gulped down the now brilliantly violet potion and focused his mind on the form of Edge Elvak. The dark magic took him, knocking his physical body senseless as he slipped into a storm of sights and sounds, flying from his body and the room on black wings of determination. As his spirit floated away, a crooked smile lay transfixed on his face, and in the fevered dreams that followed the uncovering of Elvak's location, Sultan sat on a bloody throne time and again, lording over the destruction done in his name by being so grotesque and inhuman as to be beyond description. Edge woke to the throbbing pain in his leg. He managed to peel back a corner of the bandage and could see the blood was mostly dried. While he certainly wasn't going to die from loss of blood, he thought the pain might do him in. Through the haze that was his vision, he saw Roman had left his makeshift bed, having his pack neatly prepared for travel. From the soft pressing weight on his shoulder, Edge knew that Raymir still slept on, seemingly unperturbed by the dark tidings that had befallen her of late. Edge sighed and closed his eyes. The pain didn't fade, but he could focus on images in his mind, rather than those in the past, which only reminded him of their seemingly insurmountable situation. He heard boots in the soft snow and looked up to see Roman returning, clad in his leather armor with metal studs covered in a thin layer of snow. He clutched his short sword in one hand and a strange plant in the other. Kneeling by Edge, he extended the plant to him. "Chew on the stem. It should ease the pain." Edge complied and soon found the pulsation of pain punctuated by occasional sharp twinge that dulled to a mere ache, with occasional spikes of real discomfort. He watched Roman shake off the snow he had inadvertently collected and pile a small stack of twigs in the center of the path. Using flint and tinder from his pouch, he set the pile alight and rested his back against the hard base of the mountain. Edge shifted slightly, careful not to wake Raymir. "Did you find anything? Clearly the end of the trail is not far from here." Roman nodded. "It took me an hour or so at an easy pace to find it. On your leg it may take us 2. "Where does the pass open up?" Roman grunted. "Amidst the mountains. I would say it's some sort of valley in the center of the dragon scales. How we get beyond them will depend on Raymir's map." "No towns nearby, then?" Roman shook his head. "None. The Sunderblade's hold is supposed to be near Glaciar, but like any orc tribe, they are unlikely to seek us out, and we won't spot them unless we have a clear sense of where to go." Edge rubbed his fingers over the wood handle of his halberd. "They won't attack us either, I suppose that's something. We will have to get out of the mountains quickly. Our supplies will last us but a few days, and we have to begin at least partially replenishing them. We still have plenty of wood to burn, at least. That way we won't freeze." They sat in silence for a time, each dwelling on their dire predicament. Edge nearly drifted off again when Roman spoke hesitantly. "I heard you talking to Algathor before, about your ancestry. Exactly where are you from, Edge?" The young warrior eyed the older man with a wry smile. "It took you some time to ask me that. Most just stare at the stark white hair or the green eyes. I've heard many call my appearance unnerving." Roman shrugged as he said, "Didn't want to be rude about it." "No fear of that. You likely know of the Lost Elves, found mostly in Haddon Merk." "Yes, one of the first mortal peoples, isolationists, if I recall. Indeed, they're said to scuttle ships that sail too close to the islands. But once, there was a great flurry of desire to connect with other mortal races of Tethtanir, and the Lost Elves sent out missionaries to chosen locations. It was a great sacrifice, for those who went were never allowed to return. The Elvak family sent many of their larger house, and it's to one of these lines that I owe my descendants." "An old family," Roman agreed. "And one recently in disgrace, so the tales say. Did you ever think of changing your name?" "No, it's my name. I'll not run from it." Edge's tone was defiant, and Roman chose to let the matter drop, instead saying, I read about the emergence of the elves once, as a child. Many mortal races, including elves, are supposed to draw their ancestry from the first mortals, the Revenants. It said the Revenants were the first race the gods created, and they retained some of the immortals' innate magical powers, and that even after the Great Exodus, some still can be found in Southron. Edge waved his hand. I know nothing of them, but what you have said. Of my own people, I have only ever known one, my twin brother Aedwulf. Wolfbane found us both on a small island in the Syrian Sea, in a town called Elanus. The island had a temple to Neroth, whose priests raised us when no one else would take us in. We never knew how we came to live there. It was kept secret from us. Maybe the people of Elanus never knew themselves. Where's your brother now? Edge turned to look at the windswept trail. I don't know. He was with me on the island. We trained under Wolfbane there. When I left with the army, he was still there, but I do not think he would have stayed. He was always more a fan of cunning and guile, and Wolfbane often talked often of Aedwulf's role in Neroth's grander scheme, but I don't know what part he was to play. Aedwulf and I were ostracized for our differences. Even though the townsfolk took us in, they feared us as well. You've noticed my eyes, of course. Why they glow green, I don't know. None of the Lost Elves do. Supposedly it's the defining trait of our race, but it frightens people. As much as I trained myself to kill, to wage war indiscriminately, I wanted to be recognized as a man of other qualities. I'm not a heartless killer, and neither is my brother, but he seemed to embrace the distrust and actively work to foster qualities that made others fear him. Roman swallowed visibly and paused a moment before forging into a topic he knew would be dangerous to discuss. I can tell you why they fear you. Edge looked up sharply, asking, Beyond my appearance, you mean? It goes back to the War of the Lion. You said you knew about the Elvok name, but perhaps not why it's so reviled. Vakhtyn Elvok, the man who destroyed his family's name, did so in a fashion so repulsive it is infuriating to even hear the tale. Algathor mentioned him killing the commander of the Eagle Knights, though he seemed skeptical it was actually his doing. He should not have been. Roman's tone was harsh and emphatic. There is much mystery about Bullwife Margrave's death, certainly, but it's the motive of his killer that eludes history, not the man's identity. You seem to be certain of this. Roman eyed him and proceeded more cautiously in his response. I had not heard the name Elvok in many years. I do not think that a name, or even a relationship to someone who has done evil, means that they will also be flawed in the same way. I believe in my heart that Vakhtyn Elvok killed Bull the Warrior, but I also believe you are not the same man as he was, regardless of your connection to him. Edge sat in silence while this took hold on him. He had never met or known any of his ancestors, nor where they came from. Never had he known another lost elf other than his brother Aedwulf, and in his childhood only Wolfbane had possessed any knowledge of their people. Now it seemed as though his history was as black as the service he currently fled. Perhaps he was cursed. He felt compelled to inquire further. Algathor said Elvok was killed shortly after his betrayal. Roman continued the story. Vakhtyn Elvok was one of the most empowered officers among the Eagle Knights. Some believe him second only to Bull himself. He was a fierce fighter and a harsh leader. Many feared him, and rightly so. Legend has it he was the greatest swordsman of his time. Yet the story goes a young recruit, only just raised to the order, slew him in single combat upon learning he'd murdered Bull the Warrior. Who was the recruit? No one knows. He too disappeared after the battle. Vakhtyn's legendary sword, said to be enchanted with the power of flame, was never recovered. Stranger still, when the soldiers of Aves returned to retrieve their fallen brothers, they found the body of Vakhtyn Elvok missing. Edge's brow furrowed. Can they be certain he did not somehow survive? Roman shrugged and answered, Some claim he cheated death and lived, but those who saw him fall insisted death took him before he struck the earth. Edge's face had been ever darkening with black thoughts and misgivings, which Roman had taken note of and now felt it his duty to rectify. He coughed to get his attention. I mention this not to hurt you, Edge, but only because this happened within my lifetime, and it is possible you were related to this man. Regardless, it speaks not to your character. Honesty, courage, love, these things are not passed through blood. You have proven yourself a man of quality many times over. Whether or not you have a relation to Vakhtyn Elvok does not matter. You are Edgewulf Elvok, a noble man and a very good friend. Edge felt himself relax then. Roman had somehow, with simple words, dissolved all his fear. Whatever past he had, whether it included some connection to this Vakhtyn Elvok or not, it would not determine his future. He knew the path he would take. He, Roman, and Raymir would deal a blow to Wolfbane's mad plan, and then fade into the background of this greater conflict. He would keep his promise to Algathor and protect his granddaughter, no matter the cost. They would be happy somewhere, anywhere else. Edge was about to express his gratitude when Roman appeared next to him, a comforting hand on his shoulder. This is too much to digest immediately, I think. You should rest some more. We've slept a bare number of hours these past few days. Sleep, and know that Roman of Hethagar will watch over you. Edge patted his hand thankfully. I will undoubtedly sleep easier than I ever have, Roman. Thank you. Roman nodded and moved down the pass to take his post in the gradual incline of the mountain slope. The last thing Edge saw before drifting off to sleep was the older man crouched by his meager fire, a monolith of strength and determination. Edge dreamt himself into that same position, Raymir behind him, as he held off the darkness for her. She slept undisturbed in his shadow, and the evils of the world ran from the warrior with no past, for he had much future before him. That's chapter 12. Brief break before I get into 13. I'm going to mute the audio and go to the artwork stream for a second, and then I'll be back. All right, back for chapter 13. Arvadis had retired to his small home along one of the main avenues of Alderlast, the Zenith Road. The further it got from the royal palace was more market and gossip center than a royal street, at least on the southern side where the district belonged to the Hawking House. Arvadis preferred this part of town further from the palace, the royal center being a place where he felt closeted away from the people. The king had taken his oath as ruler very seriously. Part of the oath stated the king of Angladeus will protect justly and honorably the people above all else, including himself. So it was that Arvadis was prepared for the possibility of his demise for the good of his people. He knew that in his compromised position he was a perfect target for High Lord Vendile, who had lusted after the throne his entire life. Arvadis only hoped that if Vendile assassinated him, his son Varasha would be wise enough to uncover the scheme, and finally put the self-serving High Lord into exile where he belonged. If he played the game some of the other High Lords did, Arvadis would have killed Vendile long ago, but he would not stoop to that level. He would not allow a murderer on the throne, even if it was himself. Arvadis had no counter to Vendile's next move, whatever it would be, but there was very little he could do. He had announced the deaths of the paladins and other soldiers to the people and declared a day of mourning in their names. At this moment, the king would have to wait and see how this foe would try to capitalize on the disaster. Worse, Arvadis could think of nothing that would extricate Angladeus from the current predicament. He had no idea how to battle a wizard in an impenetrable fortress built into the very stone of the Pillars of Light, and Arvadis feared that the only hope for his people lay beyond its borders, perhaps if another Lagosian nation came to their rescue. He laughed softly at the idea. Angladeus was the defender of the lesser nations of Lagotia. They came to the rescue of others. It would be unthinkable to any realm that they could defeat a foe the Angladeus could not. No one would be able to save Angladeus if she could not protect herself. Arvadis and his kingdom were well and truly alone. The aged king rose from his wicker chair and walked slowly along the upper level of his modest home. Battle-worn shields decorated the walls all along the hall and in most of the rooms. They were shields that went back to the very founding of the great nation. They represented the men and women of his family going back many centuries. The Hawking House had always defended the people with their very lives, fighting for those who could not fight for themselves, and upholding the greater code of the nation. They had broken their spears on the shields of all Lagosha's great enemies, and now one damnable mage was stopping them. A sorcerer, a wielder of magic despised by all Angladaics, barred the way to the outside world. The cruel truth that the master of an art forbidden to his own people now held them trapped within their homeland did not escape Arvadas. What frightened him more was what the invaders were doing to the world beyond the Cloud Peak Basin, with Angladeus trapped in their own lands. The invaders did not set their roots between the pillars to crush Angladeus, but to enclose them. They would destroy Lagosha first, and then come for the noble nation when it was all that remained. Arvadas wondered how long it would be before the smoke of burning villages would cross the thin border of Silverleaf to the south and east. Arvadas ran his aged hands over the shields. His family's honor was held in those bits of wood and steel. He glanced out the window of his bedroom with its blank space in the wall for his own shield. Arvadas watched the people move silently back and forth along the dark streets clad in black robes. He wondered if they would hang his shield for him as they had his father's. He feared those who came after him might burn it to ashes instead. A commotion from the other side of the house brought him around from his musing. Walking to Logan's old room, he stared out the window and was shocked to see High Lord guardsmen coming down the street, attempting to push his two personal wardens out of the way. Graham and Derek were refusing to budge, and blood would be spilled if he did not interfere soon. Arvadas rushed downstairs. The two Hawking men held their positions firmly. Graham had been in Arvadas' service for over 20 years, and he was as tough as stone. His gruff and curt voice carried loudly from the street to Arvadas' ears within the manor. You cannot see the king without a grievance or a council decree, the elder guard said, and I see neither in your possession. The lead guard, of Vendile's house, gritted his teeth in frustration. Listen, you old sod, we had a decree, and your young friend here tore it to shreds. Graham was unperturbed by the flustered visitor. Well, that sounds quite unlike Derek. You must have been very rude. The Vendile men looked ready to draw swords. Arvadas remained in the shadows a bit longer, studying the contingent. They contained only guards from Vendile, Hoddock, and Bwemmer, with a smattering of unsure and nervous-looking members of Zarinth and Galden. Those two had the customary 3 representatives for providing escort to nobles called before the council for violations of the code, but the others had more than twice the traditional number. Representatives of houses Calavar and Arindian were nowhere in sight. Things were not looking well for the king, but he had bloodshed to avoid. Friends, he announced, entering the faint lamplight at last. Enough good men have died tonight without adding to that number now. All present were surprised by the king's sudden appearance. Graham tried to warn him back into the house, but Arvadas' look silenced him. If one of them was going to fall, it would be he alone. Arvadas turned cordially to the guards, saying, State your business with the king, sirs. The lead man, Vendile's guard, turned a frustrated gaze on the king and seemed to hesitate. Fear of Vendile overtook him, and he found his tongue. The High Lord Council has issued a decree. You're to come to the meeting hall at the palace immediately. Arvadas remained silent a moment, and Graham jumped in. You cannot take him anywhere without a formally written decree. We had one until this cur ripped it apart. You want me to pick the pieces up off the cobblestones? No, I'd rather you dig through some horse's dung for them. Arvadas interjected before the furious Vendile guard could draw his blade. I see no reason not to travel with you to the palace. Otherwise I'll never learn the nature of this decree. Let me dress more appropriately, and I shall be with you momentarily. The escort looked as shocked as Arvadas' own guards, but he consented. Arvadas went inside to change into his more formal garb. He put on the traditional Hawking House colors of gold and white, covering his fine garments with a shawl of silver and gold design, the colors of Angladaic kings. He reappeared in his doorway shortly. Graham and Derek had not moved, but both gripped their spear hafts tightly. Graham put a restraining arm on the king's shoulder, whispering, This is wrong, sire. You can't be taken in such a disgraceful manner. Make them bring the traditional number and order, as the code decrees. They dishonor you. Arvadas ignored the man's fears and pulled him close. Graham was stunned both by his firm grip and fiery eyes. I'll not run from this, Graham. Now listen to me. This may be my last order, as your king. You will stay here with Derek until my son Varasho returns. You will tell him what has transpired and give him this letter from me. He must follow it precisely as it is written, and you will do as he says. Understood? Graham took the thin parchment, sealed with the Hawking stamp, and slid it under his mail tunic. It shall be as you say, my king. Arvadas smiled. Thank you. Be steadfast in your faith. Paladinus shall deliver us. Graham could not muster the words to respond. As Arvadas walked toward the escort, Derek suddenly spoke up. My lord. Arvadas turned to the young and soft-spoken guard. Yes, Derek. The young man snapped a formal salute. My life for you, sir. Arvadas smiled sadly as he returned the gesture. And mine for you. He turned and was swept into the guards and ushered along the roads toward the palace. As he walked, people noticed a flash of white among the black garb of the forlorn populace, and whispers traveled swiftly. King Arvadas marches to the palace, they said. He walks in the clothes he wore in his coronation. He wears white, but seems to carry his own shroud. Suddenly the mourning black took on new meaning for the people of Angladeus. Many feared they had now lost a king, as well as many of their bravest men. One particular pair of eyes had witnessed the exchange before the king's home. Graham and Derek kept their silent vigil over the empty house, and the people were too afraid of their response to ask where the king went this night. The same watcher observed quietly from the shadows, and waited for the people to disperse before approaching the guards. "Halt! Who goes there?" Graham's voice had a strained edge to it. He examined the cloaked figure before him. Its form was too slim to have been an armored warrior, but this knight was hiding many surprises. "State your name and business, Shadow, or I'll see if you bleed a mortal's blood." A silken voice responded with boldness. "I bleed the pure blood of the Angledaik faithful. I must speak with the prince." Graham shook his weary head. "He's not here, and only he will be allowed in the home of the Hawking House. My master bade me give you this." The figure, now clearly recognizable as a woman, held forth a round object for the guards to see. Graham's eyes climbed up his brow. "Of course, milady. I'll admit you at once." The two guards ushered the strange woman inside and returned to their posts. Derek asked no questions of his older companion. They had both seen the object the woman carried, and known immediately she must be brought inside. As the night thickened around him, the young Derek felt the tension within subside slightly. Perhaps some hope did exist. The palace halls were dark. Arvada strode sternly through them with his unwanted company of High Lord guards. They seemed fearful of him, for they knew they were violating the code in this act, but would not speak of it. Perhaps the silence eased the guilt in their souls. Arvadas turned to one of the men who wore the sigil of Zarinth over his mourning black, asking, "Why do you lack the men of Calavar, Hawking, and Arindian?" The young guard swallowed hard. "They would not come, my lord." "And why?" The guard looked ready to run under the king's scrutiny. He stammered, "Lord Vendile ordered your arrest and that of the High Lords Arindian and Calavar. Their men either ordered by their masters to stand aside or were killed, but none would participate in the escort." Arvadas acted as though it surprised him. "Indeed, I would think such men would be honored to act on behalf of their kingdom, if they felt the summons to the palace was just." The guard could not fathom how to respond to this thinly veiled insinuation. Arvadas pressed it no further. Varasho had pointed out that separations among the houses, and clearly Vendile had not won them all over, but Vendile would also not call the council to sit without the High Lords present, as such a transgression would ensure civil war. He had the army and priests by way of Geladan Wemer and Brusius Slatic. Most likely rooted in Calavar and Fremon Arindian, were being forced to sit in under guard, even if they had agreed to come in an effort to avoid bloodshed, as Arvadas had. He almost smiled to think of how Runadin would react when he arrived. The gruff leader of the Paladins would be furious at his own late-night eviction, but even more so at his friends. Yet if Vendile had called the council, he must be confident of success in whatever lay waiting for Arvadas in the palace. The thought soured the brief moment of the king's amusement as they reached their destination. The council doors loomed before him, and Arvadas steeled himself. For the first time in his life, he recited the oath of the Napoleon army he'd heard long ago. "No retreat except by coffin, no ground given, without my blood to water it." The young guard looked at him in near horror, and Arvadas' smile was determined but equally unnerving. "You think I will step down so easily?" The doors opened, and the king entered his council chamber. Vendile's good mood was ruined by the appearance of a silver and gold-clad Arvadas. The old fool would not simply move aside. Arvadas had to know that Vendile was assured of victory if he'd sent the guard's escort not fitting the requirements of the code. That miserable document would be the first thing Vendile would destroy when he took the crown. Now the High Lord had to bend his will towards that goal. Arvadas could not be allowed a chance at resistance. Freyann's plan seemed solid, but it all hinged on the fear inspired by Vendile's presence and his promises of glory and wealth for all the High Lords. This had not convinced Calavar and Arindian, but they would be imprisoned along with Arvadas for defying the new ruler if it became necessary. But the old king was slow in leaving. Arvadas swept into the high-ceilinged room and stopped as the guards from his escort filed around the outer ring. Arvadas took in the details of the council chamber he knew so well. The banners of every house hung from 8 pillars of the circular hall, swaying slightly from the movements of the guards spreading about the room. It was smaller than the grand hall where public audiences were held, and the council chamber was a more intimate setting, meant to house only the 8 High Lords who ruled over the nation and their district of Alderlast. The table was round, and it took up most of the room. 8 panels extended the colors of each house to the center of the table, where a winged helm of silver on a bronze field, the symbol of Paladinus, showed the kingdom's devotion to their god. The entire room glowed with the gentle light of the moon that leaked through the small glass dome at its height. Arvadas could feel his soul rise with the majesty of the hall he stood in, and it fell when he saw Vendile lean on his end of the table, symbolically opposite to Arvadas' own. The High Lord eyed his opponent triumphantly, but before he could speak a word, he was beaten to the punch by the irate cries of the fiery High Lord Calavar. "This is blasphemy of the highest order, Carcyrus. I'll see your head on a pike before the end of this meeting." Vendile glared at the old campaigner. With the fashionable mustache and well-groomed hair of the Paladins, Runadin Calavar looked imposing, even in his nightshirt. The 2 guards flanking Calavar had his shoulders in a firm grip, barely keeping the infuriated old man in his seat. For all his 50 years, the High Lord Calavar seemed to have grown harder. He was nearly beating off the strength of 2 much younger men. Vendile walked over to the furious Calavar, reveling in his superior appearance and authority in the purple and black silk tunic with silver trimming. Vendile felt superior to the regal and blustery warrior for the first time in his life. The image of power was power itself, and Vendile proved it by viciously backhanding the High Lord with his mailed fist. "You will keep silent, old man, or meet the fate you presume to hand to me." Calavar had reeled at the blow, and his nose and lip were a ruined, bloody mess. His head fell forward in defeat, and Vendale sneered and turned on his heel, nearly running into the current king. Vendale was temporarily taken aback. He hadn't heard Arvadas come around the table, even moving so swiftly and aggressively. He shouted to his guards, "Seat him! He's not to touch me!" Arvadas was dragged back to his place at the table, his brilliant blue eyes boring into his hated foe. Vendale recovered from his moment of fear and surveyed the other High Lords. Fremen Arindian was guarded doubly in a fashion similar to that of Calavar. A younger lord than his close friends Arvadas and Runodin, Fremont was a calm and calculating man, but he too wore only his bedclothes. By contrast, Hladic and Bremer were dressed as finely as Vendile, but not so extravagantly that they might have outshone him. The allies of Carceres Vendile commanded both religion and the machine of war in the kingdom of Angladeus, and thus were his trump cards in this dangerous bid for the throne. Observing and perhaps only partially comprehending the vicious feud playing out before them were the leaders of Zarinth and Galden, whose Highlords looked frightened and stunned. Arvadas wondered if they realized that it would be they who would sway the outcome of the meeting. Touching the pendant hanging from the chain given to him by Freyan, Vendale began his carefully planned speech. Almost 3 months ago, we learned that our kingdom was imprisoned by a great threat that appeared suddenly using methods beyond our understanding. A foe was allowed to dig at their claws into the very doorstep of our kingdom. Why? We were trapped because, my fellow High Lords, our esteemed king was lax in the defense of our nation. He allowed the enemy to camp at our door. He allowed him to murder our people and those who would come to us for trade and wisdom. He allowed our very existence as a country to be put into jeopardy. And worst of all, he has done nothing to effectively correct this predicament. Nothing. Vendale had been walking slowly around the table as he spoke, and when he finished he emphatically brought both fists down before High Lord Galden, who flinched so badly he nearly fell over in his seat. Vendale paused, but only briefly. High Lord Bremer has assured me that if he had been allowed to expand our reign beyond the Pillars of Light, this incursion would never have happened. It is foolish policy of hawking kings that we stay confined within our meager borders. We are the most powerful nation in the continent. We should be an empire, and not a mere kingdom in a valley. And I suppose you would be the one to do this for us, Vendile. High Lord Arindian's inquiry was voiced softly, but firmly. Vendile turned blazing eyes upon him, but did not respond. Instead, he began pacing again, gesturing emphatically as he made each of his points. We are too long held captive to fight out of this corner. We must negotiate with the invaders. Calavar raised his bowed head in desperate protest. You're a madman. We can't parley with murderers. It would be blasphemy to the ideals of our most holy god. Vendile sneered at the paladin leader. And what would you say our god would have us do? Attack again? Your men have had their chance and failed. It's time for a new route to be taken. I propose we parley with the invaders, seek to find common ground and understand them. Then when the time is right, we will strike at them when they least suspect it, and take back what is ours. These people have slaughtered innumerable innocents in the name of the god of death. They've burned, pillaged, raped, and murdered. Naras' intentions are clear. He means to bring the world to heel by force. These people are not our allies, nor can they even be bartered with. They are our sworn enemies, and enemies of Paladinus. Ah, Arindian, you fool, Vendale wagged his finger at the High Lord. Have we not maintained that same form of control over our people under the guise of justice and law? How is it so different from Naroth's own goals? And if we took command of all that we could, with our mighty armies and strength of belief, would the other peoples of Tethnir not be happier ruled over by Paladinus rather than the god of death? The rightful place of Angladeus is the mightiest nation in all of Lugotia. That destiny should be our guiding light, not the fear that Paladinus will strike us down for daring too much. Arindian was livid. How dare you blaspheme the Lord of Honor in this holy place? Hladic, how can you allow this foul beast to speak so? The leader of the priests smiled benevolently as he replied. My upstart, young Arindian, you seem to think that our good High Lord Vendile is shunning our god. To the contrary, he is embracing him by seeking to both embrace and spread his doctrine. Yes, some of the message may be delivered through dark art of combat, but in those moments come many opportunities for our people to prove their valor before Paladinus himself. High Lord Vendile even plans to usurp the authority of this Nerothian force at the opportune moment, freeing many in the northern lands from the yoke of oppression. My priest and I have conferred and believe Paladinus himself would wholeheartedly approve of this plan. Arvadas blocked out the rest of the argument and observed the sitting High Lords. Arindian was young, perhaps 27 years, but no more. His stately posture was quivering under the outright foulness present in the room as it bombarded his faith in his country and sense of duty to what it was meant to stand for. Arvadas would have liked to soothe the loyal High Lord, but this was not the time or place. Galden and Zarinth were younger still than even Arindian. Zarinth barely over 15 years. They were being forced into this somehow, but Arvadas could not unravel the methods that Vendile was using to coerce them. The elder men were equally divided between his camp and Vendile's. The two lackeys of this coup looked extremely confident. Even Bremer's chin stroking could not conceal his grin of satisfaction. Whatever plan they had concocted, it was working out as they expected. Arvadas decided it was time to stop that. My dear lords, he said, interrupting Hladic and Arindian, while rising almost effortlessly despite the eyes of the watchful guards. He noted that they feared to touch him, suggesting he still held some authority here. I will be the first to admit I've failed us. I have not led an adequately prepared kingdom against our foe. However, the only open aid I've received has come from House Calavar's paladins and Irindian's own personal guard. Arvadas wheeled on Hladek, suddenly demanding, "Where were your priests when my men were bleeding out after the first assault on that dread fortress? And where was the army I called for, Boehmer? I have yet to see a single soldier that did not come in defiance of your own orders, to remain clear of the Pillars of Light." The two High Lords started to stammer out answers, but they could not speak. Vendile made as though to interject, but a look from Arvadas cut him down from his pedestal, and he closed his mouth quickly. "We cannot and will not ally with these barbarians, not even in deceit. We must unite, which will not happen in circumstances such as these. We face a greater foe than we have ever known, and only our combined efforts can thwart him." It was a kingly appeal, given with calm and authority. Vendile could see the effect it had even on his minions. The youthful High Lords Galdin and Zarinth were nodding slightly, while Hladek and Boehmer looked terrified and ready to abandon the scheme. Vendile sensed the moment and plunged forward, leaning onto the table and striking with his fist, trying to quell the fear swiftly. "Enough! You had your chance, Hawking, and you failed. It's time for a new leader, a strong leader. You are unfit to govern the kingdom, and I ask that a council vote make this not a mere statement of opinion, but a declaration of truth. I call for the forceful abdication of King Arvadas Anglodeus of the Hawking House." The reaction was not quite what Vendile had expected. The sitting High Lords paused at the dramatic delivery, and even his own fellow conspirators seemed slightly unsure. Arvadas spoke calmly. "It will take a majority in the council to oust me from the throne, and I do not believe he can force so many hands against my person." Vendile sneered as he retorted, "I am aware of the requirements for dethroning a monarch, High Lord Hawking. As you recall, the only royal family ever removed from the position was my own. As you no doubt also remember, it was a Hawking who led the call for his loss of title. The irony of the moment is palpable, to say the least." Arvadas shook his head. "Your ancestor was dethroned for multiple violations of the Anglodean Code. What do you presume to hold as grounds for my removal?" "For failure to govern our nation as a responsible monarch should, for contributing to the deaths of our most noble soldiers, but most of all, for incompetence through inaction and stubbornness. You've refused to recognize the need for our nation to expand. Too long have we stayed confined to our lands, watching over the squabbles of weaker kingdoms. Our nation should command the continent. With our power, we could end this vast and disparate petty feuds throughout Lagotia. And perhaps we might become unimaginably wealthy in the process, yourself in particular." Vendile had been relishing his speech, certain his argument had been clear and without error, but Arvadas' insight drove all semblance of control from the High Lord. Marching over to the proud current monarch, he struck Arvadas viciously across the face, knocking him back into his chair. Calavar was on his feet in an instant, despite the blades at his throat and sides. "How dare you, you fiend! You aren't worthy to lick the mud from his boots. By my honor, you'll not touch him again." Calavar's flushed cheeks subsided as the current king waved him silent with his left hand. Wiping the blood from his own face with the other, he stood again. His fierce glare forced Vendile back. In that moment, the malicious High Lord forgot he was surrounded by guards, and all he could see were Arvadas' measuring eyes before him, finding his very existence wanting. He could feel his death in the stare, and he forgot himself. He recoiled and began to shelter behind his seat, but a resolve took hold, beaten into him from a young age by his cruel father, and Vendile managed to assume his commanding position once again. He thrust the two nearest guards forward. "Enough! Your reign's over, Hawking. I once again move that the council vote to dethrone Arvadas Anglodeus." The guards hesitated, but to their relief, Arvadas sat without being forced. Calavar seemed ready to fight still, but he saw the defeated slouch of his king and friend, and suddenly it seemed his own years caught up with him as well. The fire in Calavar's eyes went out, and he too slumped in his chair. Vendile glared at the High Lord Boehmer until this seemingly distracted man realized his part in the plot had come. With as much conviction as he could muster, he said, "I second the proposal." Vendile nodded curtly. "Who else is in favor?" Slowly Hladek placed his signet ring upon his section of the table to signal his agreement. Boehmer and Vendile hurried to formally cast their votes, placing their official rings near the center circle to signify assent. Angrily, Calavar removed his and slammed it on the table edge, announcing his defiance. Irindian did the same with somewhat more deliberate calm. Arvadas also placed his ring along the table edge, and three sat opposing three. All eyes fell to the remaining houses, Zarinth and Galdin. The young High Lords looked petrified to have such responsibility fall on their shoulders. Galdin tried to assume a proud and what he must have felt was mature posture, but he could not shake off the youth of his 17 years. Zarinth stared at Arvadas as though pleading with him to help, to understand. Suddenly the king recognized the unspoken threat hanging over both, knowing now they were already under Vendile's heel. With a consoling smile, he nodded his head, forgiving them. Zarinth barely choked back his tears, but he removed his ring and threw it at the table's center. Galdin swallowed hard and did the same. Calavar sat stunned. Irindian shook his head sadly, and Arvadas merely sighed in resignation. Vendile was standing tall with a malicious and victorious grin upon his face. It had seemed impossible, but it was happening. Freyne's plan had worked after all. Carcyrus could barely contain his glee. Vendel strode around the table and stood proudly before the fallen king. Arvadas Hawking, you are hereby found guilty of crimes against the kingdom of Angladeus. You will be imprisoned until an appropriate sentence has been passed. Calavar was enraged. Execution, perhaps. Then take me too, you cur. So be it. Vendel wheeled on the High Lord. Irindian and Calavar, you shall also face the same sentence as your fallen king. And what gives you the right to make such sweeping motions in the council, Vendile? Said Irindian softly. The Angladaic code decrees that only the king can propose imprisonment. Even then, the council... There is no more council, Vendile erupted, smashing his hand on the table emphatically. Every High Lord froze in their place. Vendile was a tower of rage, his face blood red and his eyes burning. His mailed fist came down the table once again, this time shattering the portion bearing the Hawking symbol as he howled, I am the council, the throne, and the law. Now take these men away. The guards pulled the High Lords from the room, though it was not an easy task. Calavar fought tooth and nail. Irindian walked, and though it was unforced, he did so with a firm expression that made it clear he chose to make the journey, but would not accept the sentence handed down. Arvadas was dragged forcefully out, staring daggers at Vendile the whole way. The victorious High Lord watched him go with a twisted grin, fingers laced before him, and pressed it to his face in victory, and the cool metal of this strange pendant, clutched in one hand, felt wondrous against his flushed face. Then he turned to the remaining members of the council. Hladic, I wish to go through the private crowning by tomorrow afternoon so I may assume official governmental control. The public ceremony may be delayed so we can provide the appropriate degree of stateliness. Bwemmer, you will provide the army and a list of crimes the imprisoned High Lords are charged with for my announcement. Galden and Zarinth, you will not be present for my crowning. You shall return to your estates and stay there under my protection. The next king of Angladeus sat slowly in his chair, arms folded in front of him. Now go. And Bwemmer, the High Lord stopped halfway out the door and bowed slowly. Yes, my king. Bring me the head of Varasho Hawking. I want that cursed line ended. My reign must be consolidated. Of course, my king. It will be done. Bwemmer turned to leave, but Vendel called after him. Oh, and High Lord Bwemmer. Vendel smiled in deepest satisfaction. Next time, bow lower. Bwemmer nodded, then reconsidered and bowed deeply to his new ruler. Walking from the council room, he had his first doubts about the new bearer of Angladeus' crown. He had known Vendile was somewhat mad, but he could not be sure to the extent to which he would go to destroy his enemies, both real and imagined. Doubt crept into Bwemmer's mind in that moment, but he was leaving the chamber and among his men again. Stepping into the main hall of the palace, Bwemmer was joined by his personal guards. His captain, newly appointed for exemplary service, was a powerful-looking man named Renan Ordlan. His name was unusual for a commoner. In Angladeus, the noblest families had auspicious and high-sounding names, like Gelladin Bwemmer himself and the other High Lords. To have taken a name like Renan and possess a family name such as Ordlan, this guard must have had some connection to a minor noble house, perhaps one that had fallen on hard times, or been disgraced, and forced Renan to take up military service to make his way in the world. Regardless of where he had come from, Renan Ordlan had proven a reliable soldier. Young and strong, he took up the position next to his lord. Bwemmer eyed the bodyguard, taking in his unshaven features and the silvery sheen of armor decked out in red plume and cape, his clasp bearing the High Lord symbol of a charging boar. Bwemmer stopped and waved the other guards away. Renan, you were named my personal guard's captain this week. Yes, High Lord. And I have heard you advanced so rapidly due to your willingness to carry out any task, as ordered, without question. Is this true? The younger man stopped his deliberate stride and met the High Lord's eyes firmly, saying, I will do anything you command of me, High Lord Bwemmer. It is my duty. Good. Then I think it's time you proved your loyalty to my house. Bwemmer pulled Renan into a small alcove and laid down plans for murder. Beneath the Angladaic palace, the old dungeons had rotted away from years of disuse. The predecessors to Arvadas Hawking had banned their employment as a method of correction some time before his reign, choosing to focus on rehabilitation through faith and service rather than imprisonment, which many in the kingdom believed to be unnecessary and barbaric. In the case of serious crimes, Arvadas had resorted to exile and conscription for more minor ones, or repeat offenders. The result had been a severe drop in violence and crime within the kingdom, and an increase in available soldiers for defense and public works. Not merely sealing the dungeons had done that. Further emphasis on aiding and providing care to the poor and sick had reduced criminal activity, and the nation had the wealth and support to support such efforts. Now Arvadas was a victim of a practice he had tried to destroy completely during his reign. Chained to a wall in one of the damp, ill-lit cells, he sat with his arms held against the cold stone. Arvadas could see rats milling about in the distance of the unlit hall. He, Irindian, and Calavar had separate holds, each dimly visible with one slow-burning but weak torch. How long they would burn for the imprisoned was difficult to say, but the captive royal knew that once they were out, their true fight for survival would begin. Calavar's groans from his cell caught Arvadas' attention. He was concerned for the High Lord. Calavar had resisted and been severely beaten by the guards. Arvadas could not say how extensive his injuries were, but he feared for his life. Irindian was beyond Calavar in the farthest chamber. Arvadas called out hoarsely, Fremont! Fremon, are you all right? Arvadis heard shuffling and a long sigh. Well, my friend, I'm alive. That is something. Despite himself, Arvadis smiled. That's true, Fremont. We are alive. Can you see Runedin? No, I'm afraid not. My back is to him. Can you? No, I have a wall between us. Have you any idea how long our torches will last? Well, Arvadis, I'm no expert on conflagration, but I'd venture to say the torches will burn until they go out. Of course. How foolish of me. Arvadis paused, and in the silence he could hear the rats shuffling just at the edge of his vision. But let me ask you this. How long will we last? Arvadis could hear his friend's dry laughter as he answered. Well, Arvadis, that would be until someone rescues us, now wouldn't it? You really think someone will? Fremont Arindian nodded knowingly to himself in the waning light. It has been my experience that people sometimes forget kings and queens, but sons very rarely forget their fathers. In the darkness of the guttering flames, Arvadis allowed himself a small smile and the faintest glimmer of hope. Okay, so that was chapters 12 and 13. I'm going to stop the stream, and I will be getting a newsletter out later tonight or tomorrow, and I'm going to start uploading the videos that have not yet made it to the YouTube channel there. If you want to find those, you can go to YouTube channel under Vulture X21, same name that I'm using for the Twitch channel, and you can catch any of those episodes there, and they will remain up so that you can watch them anytime if you are behind on the readings. Thank you for stopping in, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the month of July.